Hollywood expected Marlon Brando to do what every promising young actor had done before him. Smile. Agree. Sign. It was the unspoken contract of the studio system. Talent was rewarded, obedience was required, and anyone who confused the two didn't last long. For decades, the machine had worked perfectly. It shaped faces, softened edges, and turned raw ambition into something marketable. Men arrived hungry and left polished. The system didn't need to break them, train them. Brando arrived different. The moment Hollywood realized that was the moment it became nervous. The warning signs came early. He didn't charm studio secretaries. He didn't linger outside executive offices hoping to be noticed. When called in, he showed up on time, spoke plainly, and left without trying to impress anyone. There was no hunger in him that could be exploited. No desperation to belong. Executives mistook that for arrogance. They were wrong. It was something far more dangerous. The meeting that changed everything took place in a quiet studio office, far from cameras and applause. No reporters. No witnesses. Just men who believed they controlled careers and a young actor they assumed would eventually understand his place. They laid out the expectations carefully. Public appearances, press tours, smiling interviews, deference to directors. No surprises. No opinions that weren't approved. No deviation from the image they planned to build around him. Brando listened. He always listened. Then he asked a question no one expected. What happens if I don't? The room stiffened. One executive laughed, assuming it was a joke. Another leaned back, studying him more closely. This wasn't how negotiations went. Actors asked how much. They didn't ask what if. You won't work, the executive said finally, keeping his voice even. Not here. Not anywhere that matters. Brando nodded, as if filing away useful information. Then I'll work somewhere else. Silence. Hollywood didn't know what to do with men who didn't fear exile. The system relied on scarcity, on the idea that opportunity was rare and approval priceless. Brando didn't treat either that way. To him, acting wasn't a favor the studio granted. It was a craft he carried with him. That unsettled them. They tried again, this time softer. They praised his talent, called him extraordinary, told him he was on the verge of something big. All he had to do was cooperate. Brando didn't argue. He didn't raise his voice. He simply said, I won't pretend to be someone I'm not. That was the moment the meeting ended. Hollywood didn't explode in anger. It did something far more effective. It withdrew. Phone calls stopped. Scripts disappeared. Meetings were postponed indefinitely. Casting directors smiled politely and promised to circle back. The message was clear. Fall in line or fade out. Brando felt the pressure immediately. Not dramatically, not violently, but persistently. Like a hand on his chest, pushing him towards silence. Friends warned him. Agents advised him to reconsider. Older actors told him everyone learned eventually. Brando listened. Then he kept refusing. He turned down roles that felt false. He questioned dialogue that rang hollow. He didn't show up to parties designed to soften him. He wasn't trying to provoke the system. He simply refused to perform obedience as gratitude. Behind closed doors, studio executives began calling him a problem. Problems, however, have a way of becoming unavoidable when they produce results. Despite the quiet resistance against him, Brando's performances couldn't be ignored. Directors who cared more about truth than approval fought to work with him. Writers rewrote scenes after watching him read lines with an honesty that exposed their weaknesses. Cameras lingered on him because they had no choice. He pulled focus without trying. Audiences felt it. They didn't know why they couldn't look away. They didn't have language for what he was doing. They just knew it felt real. Dangerous. Alive in a way Hollywood polish rarely allowed. Executives watched the numbers and grew uneasy. The man they wanted to discipline was becoming profitable. That complicated everything. Hollywood pivoted. It always did. Instead of demanding obedience, it offered compromise. New contracts arrived with friendlier language. Invitations returned. Meetings resumed. The same men who warned Brando he'd never work again now spoke of him as important and essential. Brando noticed the change. He didn't celebrate it. He read every contract carefully. He questioned clauses. He crossed out lines. He negotiated terms that gave him creative input, something almost unheard of for actors his age. Some studios balked. Others reluctantly agreed. They assumed this was temporary, that success would soften him, that once he tasted full acceptance, he'd fall in line like everyone else. They misunderstood him again. Success didn't tame Brando, clarified him. On set, he worked harder than anyone. Not louder, not more dramatically, just deeper. He asked uncomfortable questions. Why a character said this? Why a scene existed? Why a lie was being protected instead of exposed? Some directors hated it. Others realized they were witnessing something rare. Brando wasn't rebelling against authority for ego. He was rebelling against dishonesty, against shortcuts, against the idea that audiences needed to be coddled instead of challenged. That kind of rebellion was contagious. Younger actors watched closely. They didn't copy his mannerisms. They copied his courage. They saw that it was possible to survive saying no, that the studio system, for all its power, still needed authenticity more than obedience. Executives began whispering that Brando was changing expectations. They were right. For the first time in decades, an actor wasn't begging to be shaped. He was demanding space to remain whole. And the industry didn't have a clean way to punish him without hurting itself. Hollywood tried subtler pressure. Negative press. Stories about his temperament. Rumors about unreliability. The old tools sharpened. Brando didn't respond. He didn't issue statements. He didn't defend himself. He didn't perform humility to reassure anyone. Silence, when chosen deliberately, can be a form of power. The more the industry tried to frame him, the clearer it became who was uncomfortable, and why. Years passed. The balance shifted. Studios no longer summoned Brando to remind him of his place. They negotiated with him. Carefully. Sometimes nervously. They still didn't like him. But they needed him. And needing someone changes how loudly you can threaten them. Brando understood that leverage was temporary. He never mistook it for safety. He kept his distance. Took breaks. Walked away when the work felt hollow. He never chased relevance. He let it find him. Hollywood eventually rewrote the story, as it always does. They called him revolutionary, iconic, a genius who transformed acting. They spoke as if they'd always supported him, as if the resistance hadn't been real. Brando didn't correct them. He didn't need to. The truth lived in the changed rules, in the contracts actors signed after him, in the creative control that became negotiable because he proved it was possible, in the idea that talent didn't have to be obedient to be valuable. That first meeting, the one where they expected him to fall in line, became something else entirely in retrospect. It became the moment Hollywood lost its certainty, not its power. Certainty. The certainty that actors would always comply, that fear would always work, that access was enough to buy silence. Brando never set out to challenge the system. He simply refused to surrender himself to it. And in doing so, he forced Hollywood to adapt. They expected him to fall in line. He changed the rules instead. Not with speeches, not with rebellion, but with a quiet, persistent refusal to betray his own dignity. That refusal echoed long after the meeting ended, long after the contracts were signed, long after the warnings stopped. It echoed every time an actor asked for creative control, every time a performer said no and survived it, every time the industry had to negotiate instead of command. Hollywood didn't like what Marlon Brando represented, but it never forgot it, and it never fully recovered from it either. What unsettled Hollywood most wasn't that Brando resisted control. It was that he did it without bitterness. He didn't posture. He didn't campaign. He didn't turn himself into a symbol. He simply lived as if the system's approval was optional. That quiet certainty unnerved people who had built their lives around being indispensable gatekeepers. Executives began to realize something too late. They had trained generations of actors to fear exclusion, but they had never prepared for someone who viewed exclusion as survivable. Behind closed doors, conversations shifted. "Watch him," one executive warned another. "He's not bluffing," said a second. "He's teaching them they don't need us," said a third. That was the real threat. Hollywood could handle ego. It could handle tantrums, excess, self-destruction. Those were familiar patterns, predictable and manageable. What it struggled with was restraint. With a man who knew when to speak, and when not to, Brando's refusal to explain himself became its own form of authority. When journalists pushed him for quotes about the industry, he deflected. When asked about his reputation, he shrugged. When baited into controversy, he disengaged. He understood something many didn't: attention was currency, and he refused to spend it cheaply. This frustrated the press as much as it frustrated the studios. They wanted conflict, confessions, regret, redemption arcs they could package. Brando gave them none of it. He denied them narrative control, just as he denied the studio's creative control. Instead, he let the work speak. And the work was undeniable. Each performance sharpened the contrast between him and the system that tried to contain him. Where Hollywood favored polish, he favored truth. Where studios preferred certainty, he delivered volatility, controlled, purposeful, human. Directors adjusted their approach when working with him. Some resisted at first, clinging to hierarchy. Others adapted quickly, realizing they were witnessing a new kind of collaboration. Scenes evolved. Scripts bent. Authority softened. This wasn't chaos. It was recalibration. And once recalibration begins, there's no returning to the old measurements. Executives noticed that sets involving Brando felt different. Crew members paid closer attention. Actors arrived better prepared. There was less indulgence for laziness, less tolerance for false emotion. He raised the temperature simply by refusing to fake anything. That pressure exposed weaknesses. Not everyone appreciated it. Some actors resented him. Others feared him. A few quietly thanked him for making it harder to hide behind technique alone. Brando never addressed any of it. He didn't mentor. He didn't preach. He simply worked as if integrity were assumed. Hollywood, slowly and reluctantly, adjusted its expectations. Contracts changed. Not overnight, but incrementally. Clauses softened. Creative discussions expanded. Actors began negotiating instead of pleading. What had once been considered difficult became reframed as serious. The language evolved because it had to. Behind the scenes, studio heads still complained. They spoke of lost control, of a new generation that didn't understand its place. But even as they complained, they adapted. The machine didn't break, it learned. And it learned because Brando forced it to. Years later, when retrospectives framed him as a turning point, the industry preferred to describe the shift as inevitable. As if culture had simply evolved on its own. As if no one had resisted. As if no risks had been taken. That was the lie Hollywood told itself to stay comfortable. The truth was quieter and more unsettling. Change didn't come because the system wanted it. It came because one man refused to internalize fear. Brando paid a price for that refusal. Isolation followed him. Misinterpretation. A loneliness that came with being out of step with expectation. He was admired but rarely embraced. Celebrated but seldom trusted. He accepted that trade. He understood that freedom often comes without applause. By the time Hollywood fully acknowledged his influence, the battle was long over. The rules had already shifted. The leverage had already redistributed. The precedent had been set. Actors could say no and survive. They could demand respect and receive it. They could insist on honesty and be rewarded for it. Those ideas didn't originate in boardrooms or contracts. They originated in a quiet office, during a meeting where a young actor asked a question no one wanted to answer. What happens if I don't? Hollywood had relied on fear to answer that question for decades. Brando answered it differently. He showed that the worst outcome, exclusion, resistance, silence, was still preferable to surrendering oneself. That dignity wasn't something the industry granted. It was something you protected. They expected him to fall in line. He didn't. And in refusing to do so, he forced Hollywood to confront a reality it had avoided for generations. That control only works when people believe they have no alternative. Brando proved there was always an alternative. Not an easy one. Not a safe one. But a real one. And once that possibility existed, Hollywood could never fully unlearn it. That was the rule he changed. Not written. Not announced. Bit permanent.